Today, we have a very renowned personality with us, an international personality. And we are proud to be with him today to discuss a very current issue. It is none other than Justice Weeramantry, who is the author of this famous book called Islamic Jurisprudence, an international perspective. I wish to emphasize on this word, an international perspective. Your Excellency, we go back in time for a quarter century, 1980s, 88, let us say exactly, and you take your pen to write this book. What were your thoughts at that time?
Well, I had always been interested in the multicultural sources of law, and I had a very special opportunity of pursuing this interest further when America was celebrating its bicentennial in 1976. And there was a great conference on the underlying themes of the American Constitution, namely equality and freedom. It was a great international conference held in America to celebrate the bicentennial. And at that time, they wanted to see what other cultures had to say about these concepts of equality and freedom. Of course, at that time there were three worlds: the Western world, the communist world, and the third world.
And we belong to the third world.
We belong to the third world. So it so happened that I was asked to be the spokesman for the third world. So I had to prepare a very detailed presentation. And that made me look into the cultures of the third world, particularly from the standpoint of equality and freedom. And the more I looked into them, the more I found that these are not new ideas, that these are age-old ideas embedded in the cultures of all our Asian countries. And I did a lot of research in preparation for my speech, which took me into Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and all the other Confucian thought and so on. And this made me even more interested in the intercultural aspect of religion, the foundations of equality and freedom as taught by the great religions, and the fact that there was a great bond between religious teaching and international law, which everybody had tended to forget. So all these combined together to make me take an interest in all the religions. So Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and of course Christianity and Judaism. I looked into all of these to see what they had to say about what we today call international law and human rights.
Now, those days there was no 9/11 and there wasn't terrorism, and Islamic law was unheard of in the West. And you put the pen to put it in writing, and you also made this speech. How did the world take it?
Well, I must say that after I made my presentation, now I was talking for the third world, and so I was the third speaker, I was the last speaker. And I must say that after I spoke, the other two speakers came up to me and said that there were so many wonderful things they had learned about our cultures which they had never heard of before. So that encouraged me greatly, and I wanted to pursue this even further, not merely for academics and lawyers, but to get through to the general public. So that has been a lifelong interest ever since.
Oh yes, it's very interesting. And as a student of law, Sharia law, how does it merge or conflict with the English law that we are practicing?
There is no conflict on basic principles. All religious teachings are fundamentally the same, whether it is in regard to your duties to your neighbor, your duties to yourself, your duties to your state, your duties to the environment, your duties to future generations. They all teach identically a very high sense of duty. And that's what the world forgets. There is so much coincidence in the teachings of the great religions. And people talk about that 1% or 0.1% difference and emphasize that as if that is all, whereas the 99% agreement is left totally unexplored.
It is a folly for this generation, I would say. It is.
It is the height of folly when we have so much religious wisdom ingrained in all these cultures. All that is there just lying untapped. And I have done my best to try to tap that source of wisdom and bring it into international law.
Thank you very much for that effort. And today, 25 years later, when the world has changed, we are on the eve of releasing this Sinhala translation of your work. How do you feel about it?
Well, I'm very happy that this is being done. I thought it should have been done long ago, and I thought there should have been translations into other languages too, because some of my other books have been translated into Spanish and German and Japanese and so on. But this is something that should have been done long ago, and I'm so happy that a start is being made with this Sinhala translation, because there's so much about Islam that the world does not know and ought to know. And perhaps we can discuss that a little later, but the total ignorance that prevails among 99% of the non-Islamic public about the richness of the teachings of Islam. And I can say the same about other religions too. The richness of Hinduism and Buddhism and so on is very, very little known.
Yes. And also, having been a student of law, a practitioner, a teacher of law, do you find these religious laws in general and Islamic law in particular conflicting with the day-to-day life of a human being?
On the contrary, religious law reinforces the rules of ordinary law. And this is not known. In fact, in Christianity, I have written a book called The Lord's Prayer, where I am trying to show that in that little prayer, the most authoritative prayer in Christianity, are encapsulated over 100 human rights, which people do not realize. They just mechanically repeat the prayer. So there's so much practical wisdom in religious teaching. We only go for the religious teaching and forget the practical connection.
So it is a man-made division virtually.
It is a man-made
division. And practically all religions teach more or less the same thing, to truth and non-violence, etc. What do you see the difference in this Islamic jurisprudence in that context? Do you see any differential point which may be highlighted to the Sinhala-speaking community because of this translation we are doing?
No, I want the Sinhalese community to know, as I want them to know about other religions as well, the richness of teaching there is in these religions and how it harmonizes with our culture. Now, for example, Buddhism elevates all the rules of personal conduct, how you must be humble and truthful and good to your neighbor and all that sort of thing. And all that is there in Islam. And it is highlighted by the work of generations of scholars, because there was a tremendous, shall we say, flowering of scholarship in the Islamic world in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, which produced some wonderful results in the world of scholarship. And this is not known, and the impact of that scholarship on the rest of the world is not known, and particularly the impact of that scholarship on the Western world. In fact, it triggered off the resurgence of learning in the Western world after the Dark Ages, when learning was suppressed. Those are sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, when there was a view that what the church tells you is what you need to know. God, what is in the Holy Book is all you need to know. But the value of human inquiry was discounted. Right. Now, it is the world of Islam that brought up once more the importance of human inquiry. And this is a very interesting story, which I think even many lawyers do not know. That there was the doctrine that what God wants you to know is in the divine teachings. So forget about your puny human intellect. You can't improve on that. But the Islamic scholars in Islamic Spain and elsewhere, they said, true enough, there is divine teaching, divine revelation, but there is also the brain which God has given us, which must not rust unused. It was given to us for us to use it, and we must use it to further our knowledge. So this was not very well accepted in the Western world. And there were Islamic philosophers, particularly two philosophers in Islamic Spain, Averroes and Avicenna, who worked out what they called the doctrine of double truth. That is, there is truth that comes to us by divine revelation, but there is also truth that comes to us through human inquiry. And they supported this by some wonderful hadiths of the Prophet, where the Prophet Muhammad had said, "The ink of the scholar is holier than the blood of the martyr." Knowledge is so important that you should even go to China in search of it. So the scholars worked on that and developed the importance of human inquiry. And they worked out the doctrine of double truth. Truth that comes by divine revelation, truth that comes by human inquiry. Now Averroes was so influential in Islamic Spain that he had followers called the Averroists. And they were internationally famous, and even in the University of Paris there was a group of followers of Averroes called Averroists.
Averroists, yes.
So the Averroists took the doctrine of double truth to the University of Paris, and they were not accepted there. And so that doctrine was rejected till Thomas Aquinas, the great scholar of the Catholic Church, he said, no, there is a great deal of truth in this. He had studied the works of Averroes and he gave it legitimacy. And then it was accepted. And when it was accepted, in the words of great scholars, the horse of reason, which had been kept confined in the stable, bolted and could never be put back again. And that is what led to the Renaissance and the Reformation and everything else, the resurgence of learning in Europe. And it was not only religious learning. As a result of this attitude, learning in all the sciences, physics, chemistry, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, whatever you might name, had progressed enormously in the Islamic world. And when the gate was opened, as I described to you, all this knowledge flooded into the West.
That's right, yeah. When that past is so illustrious, so great, today when you come to Islamic law, what the layman hears is chopping off a hand,
yes,
or stoning somebody to death, or the farda. What has happened?
What has happened is that there has been a great deal of distortion. You know, particularly in the Western world, the only, shall we say, a spiritually based rival they faced for 1,000 years was Islam, because Buddhism and Hinduism and so on were too remote. So the great spiritual rival they faced was Islam. So there was animosity between the two groups for 1,000 years. So you try to paint your enemy as badly as you can. And this went on both sides. It went on both sides for 1,000 years, not realizing that there was so much commonality of outlook, commonality of teaching, which was completely lost. So this is something that we have got to revive, particularly because my philosophy is that humanity has no future unless we think in terms of one world. We have got to forget all our distinctions and think of the human race as one family living in a small planetary home with limited resources. We have to conserve all of that, and that is the rightful inheritance of all future generations. We have to preserve it and enrich it and pass it on to them with all this cultural knowledge.
Thank you, Your Excellency. The Muslims of Sri Lanka and perhaps and Muslims of the world must be very grateful to you for bringing this work to them in English first and in Sinhalese now. And when we release this book in a few days' time, the younger people need to be inspired towards what?
Towards, as I told you, we are no longer this group or that caste or this tribe. We are human beings. We are living on one shrinking planet, shrinking in the sense that it is getting notionally smaller every day with communications and so on. So we are one race, we have limited resources, we have to protect each other, we have to love each other, we have to follow the basic principles of all religions. Now Jesus said, love thy neighbor as thyself. All religions say that, and Islam too, as the teaching that you have to do what you can for your neighbors. And in Islamic teaching, there is the notion of bidding unto good. Now, bidding unto good means you must not merely wish your neighbor well, you must do what you can in a practical way to help him. So now take Western law. If you are passing a baby who is drowning in a puddle of water, right, you can pass by, you are a good citizen, you are doing nobody any wrong. But that's absolutely wrong in Islam. You have got to do, you have a duty to rush to that person's rescue, a duty under the law. Now the trouble with Western law is that it has become too legalistic, going quite contrary to what Christ taught. Christ taught that the letter of the law is not what is important, it is the spirit behind the law. The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. But that's not how Western law functions very often. The Western laws are far too legalistic. Now in Islam you have this idea that that won't do. You have got to do something actively towards helping that person. And if you take all these great teachings of religion, which I say underlie all domestic law and international law, you will find this total correspondence. Take for example, as I said, my duty towards my neighbor. I must not bear a grudge. I must not be angry. I must not be jealous. I must show him goodwill. I must help him when I can. Give assistance in distress. Be friendly. Share resources. Now all that is Christian teaching. All that is Islamic teaching. It is there in the Quran, it is there in the Hadiths. Then likewise Hindu teaching, Buddhist teaching, Judaic teaching, and also there is the teachings of Confucius and all, for example, Zoroastrianism and Baha'i teaching and so on. All that wisdom is there, but the world does not know it. So we have got to harness that as a new source of strength for international law and for domestic law. And that's why I have said that the need of the hour, not only in Sri Lanka but all over the world, is peace education. Because we grew up in the cultural box into which we were born, and we know nothing else. Now when I was in school, I had the great advantage that we were only 500 boys in the school, and the principal every morning would have a school assembly at which today he'll read from the Bible, tomorrow from the Quran, next day from the Dhammapada, next day from the Bhagavad Gita. And even as boys of 12, 13, 14,
they were able to assimilate.
We assimilated, we knew something about other religions. But today children grew up in a cultural box. They don't know anything at all. Now I say, and I've just given my support to a movement to have worldwide peace education in every school. And I have my own peace studies center which I've carried on for some years. And there, one of the 3 pillars on which I base it is cross-cultural understanding. And when we have our workshops at our center, we commence every day with readings from the 4 religions. And the students themselves choose the scriptural passages and they talk about it, and then they engage in a lively discussion among themselves, and we sit at the back and we are highly inspired to hear what they say. So this is wonderful. When they come to know each other's religions, they become so interested. And I have said that peace education is a must, not only in all countries and for Sri Lanka in particular. I have stressed that over and over again. In my evidence before the LLRC, I said it. And I have said it in so many papers and pamphlets and books. You have to have peace education as compulsory in all schools, and Sri Lanka is particularly fortunate because there are very few countries in the world where you can walk down one street and see a mosque and a temple and a kovil and a church. Indeed. And all functioning in harmony with each other. And when we were children, we knew no distinctions. We participated in each other's festivals. Now that's how it should be, and we can radiate the light of this understanding throughout the world. That is what we are not doing. We have to do it, and we have all the resources to do it. And there are ancient Greek writings in which they describe Sri Lanka as the blessed isle from which all this radiates. We can do that again.
Yes, I think with the growth of knowledge, the ease of acquisition of knowledge, haven't we gone backwards in this whole concept?
The whole world has gone back.
Yes, whole world. Rather than building bridges, we are building walls between communities and religions. And how will this book help in that?
This book will help to dispel the ignorance that now prevails about Islam. Now take even my international law friends, whom I meet from time to time. Many of them do not know that the first books, the first treatises on Islamic law, on international law, were written by Islamic jurists almost 800 years or 900 years before they first appeared in the West. You know, in the Western world, the first major treatise, there were treatises by Spanish jurists and so on. And in 1625, the great Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius wrote his famous book on War and Peace. Right? That is generally taken to be the starting point of modern international law. And there were, for a century before that, Spanish jurists also who wrote about this. So that was fine. Now, Western lawyers therefore think that international law began in the 17th century. But in the 8th century, there were treatises on Islam, on international law by Islamic jurists. And this was not known. Treatises dealing with what? Dealing with the duties of sovereigns to each other, the duties of respect for diplomats, the sanctity of treaties, conduct on the field of battle, humanitarian conduct, duty towards children, duty towards future generations, duties of trusteeship, duties of honesty in trade. I could name 50
all this
of
in
them.
Islamic law.
All that is in the Islamic international law.
Yeah, indeed.
And people do not know that some of this went into the West through translations. There was a very famous jurist king called King Alfonso X of Castile, who wrote a magnificent encyclopedia of knowledge in his time. And he tried to, it was a real encyclopedia, and there was a volume on every subject, so to speak. There was a volume on international law too. And the students who have gone into that have said that that volume on international law is virtually a reproduction of what the Islamic jurists had written a couple of centuries before. So, and that way it might have got through to the West. And also the great learning of Islamic civilization, whether in physics, chemistry, medicine or whatever, infiltrated to the West, as I told you. For example, this Averroes, whom I spoke about earlier, apart from being a famous philosopher, was also a famous professor of medicine. And his textbooks on medicine, in translation, were used in Western universities for 400 years. Now that was the degree of learning. He was like Leonardo da Vinci, that sort of people. And they blossomed in Islamic civilization. For example, Islamic libraries in the 9th century would have 600,000 books. Whereas, say, the University of Oxford, so many centuries later, was very proud when they got a donation of 100 books from somebody. So these things are not known in the Western world, and they need to be known to everybody. And likewise, there's a great deal about the West which the Islamic world does not know. The ignorance on one side is matched by the ignorance on the other side. So we have to build bridges and show what great cultures both these are, and how much they have to offer each other, and how together they can strengthen the entire human future.
Thank you very much, Justice Weeramantry. It has been a pleasure talking to you this afternoon. You have taken us back down the pages of history and brought us back to the 21st century. And you have given a lesson to the next generation, both in Sri Lanka and in the world. Thank you once again. It's been a pleasure talking to you.